Hello, everybody. This is Jimmy. We're reading with Jimmy. We're reading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Chapter 8, The Queen's Croquet Ground. Before we start the next two pages of analysis, which are pages 92 and 93, we got a couple of emails that I want to go over and I want to share with you. The first one says, Jimmy, you told us not to read outside the story, but to use the facts within the story to analyze it. Aren't you stretching things when you say that the croquet game chaos is like life? Thank you for the question. I'm not really reading from outside the story. What I'm doing is explaining what Alice is going through inside the story. A young girl coming of age. She's learning about who she is throughout the journey in Wonderland. And this croquet game is a mirror image of life when you think about it. You know, some people would call this personification. If you remember, we looked at that word before. We also defined it. It's putting human characteristics to something non-human or representing an abstract quality in some type of human form. And in this case, life is being personified by a croquet game. But not the normal croquet game. Because the game of life is actually, well, it doesn't really have rules, does it? Other than you have to eat to survive, you have to sleep, you have to have social encounters and self-esteem. Do you remember our discussion about Maslow? So all I'm doing when I'm comparing croquet games to life is pointing out that I'm doing this because in case you missed it, I'm adding some of the appreciation I got out of the book and sharing it with you. And I want you to think about it and you might not agree with it. That's okay too. Obviously, the question was, challenging Jimmy, which is good. Because as I said, great literature like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, it's here and it stays here and it lasts the test of time for a reason. It helps us lead our lives better by watching these characters in the story lead theirs. Alice, full of doubt, doubting herself, who she is, what she is. Journeys, she has adventures, and she helps define herself. That's what we do. She overcomes her fears. She shows bravery, all the while trying to understand everything around her, just like we do when we live day to day, no? Well, thank you very much for the question. The second email we got says, Jimmy, you mentioned that in this chapter, Alice is feeling more courageous. Where does her courage come from? Excellent question. Well, you can see that when the procession arrives with the card that we come to know is really just a deck of cards, when that procession arrives, Alice doesn't lie down on her face like the gardeners. Why? Well, because she never heard of such a rule of lying down when a procession comes by. And you can go back and reread that if you'd like. And throughout the story, we see Alice comparing her Wonderland experiences with the rules that she has learned before entering Wonderland. For example, one of the rules we learn, don't cross the street without looking both ways. So Alice's inability to say the multiplication tables, or doubting herself when she draws conclusions like how many hours are in a day and so on. These are experiences she's comparing to her own real experiences and the experiences in Wonderland. So rules are part of understanding where courage comes from, because sometimes if you're going to break a rule, it takes courage to break a rule, doesn't it? But of course, you have to know what the rules are. But Alice is not breaking any rules in this case, in this procession, because she knows that she's actually keeping the rule from her reality of life before entering Wonderland, which says never lay down during a procession or you'll miss the procession. So Alice, in a weird way, ironic way, is actually keeping the rule and not breaking it, which in Wonderland is actually courageous. Because in Wonderland, the rule is basically fall down on your face when that procession arrives. So it seems confusing, but I suggest that you really think about rules and courage, where your courage comes from, where your courage flees, flees when it leaves you. Also remember that our discussion of fear was in this chapter. Courage means you're overcoming your fear. You're not losing your fear entirely. In fact, we can argue that you actually need your fear to stay with you in order to be courageous, because fear sticks with you actually throughout the courageous act. You just put it on the side and do what you need to do. Courage means overcoming it, not losing it. So fear and courage, of course, by the way, is always shown in action. Well, let me correct myself. Sometimes you can think about things in different ways, and that takes courage, doesn't it? To think about things in different ways and not think about the things the same way all the time. So remember, it's really when Alice encounters the procession and has a conversation with the queen, and she realizes that these are just a pack of cards after all. And from that point on, she's no longer afraid. And when she's no longer afraid, she no longer has to be courageous. She just deals with the situation. Not a matter of being courageous. She just doesn't, she's not afraid anymore. And therein lies part of what you want to understand about fear and courage. Courage is only shown by Alice when she remembers that the queen is always ready to chop off heads, including hers. And so Alice is always, as you'll see now and you'll see later on, she's always very careful when that queen is around. That's not just courageous. That's smart. So thank you for your emails. We really, really appreciate. Keep them coming. Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Analysis of these 2 pages. We left off with Alice talking to the cat about how everyone was quarreling. Okay? So she dreadfully can't hear oneself speak and don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least if there are rules, she's saying up here, nobody attends to them. And you've no idea how confusing it is, all the things being alive. For instance, there's the ark. I've gone through the next walking about, and I should have croqueted the queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming. Croqueted. Croqueted is an interesting word. That means to drive away an opponent's ball by holding your own ball against it and striking it with the mallet. We're going to look at the rules of croquet in a minute. Not that we're going to spend a lot of time on it, but the rules of an actual croquet game are interesting, because what we're witnessing now is a croquet game with the same rules, but the equipment is alive, just like life. Didn't we just talk about that? So, how do you like the queen? Said the cat in a low voice. Why is the cat asking that in a low voice? Well, you know why. He doesn't want the queen to hear him, right? Why? Because that queen chops heads off. Not at all, said Alice. She's so extremely, and you see the dash there? Remember, punctuation is very important. Just then, Alice noticed that the queen was close behind her, listening, so she went on, she's so extremely likely to win, and that's hardly worthwhile finishing the game. So she changes her step. And remember, is she being courageous? Is she being smart? Is she being Alice? She knows what that queen is like. That queen likes to chop heads off. So she was going to say she doesn't like the queen. She's so extremely, and she was going to say something. Maybe we can guess what she was going to say. Not that we want to speculate. But instead, she says she's extremely likely to win. Alice is thinking on her feet. Wonderful. Look at how she's maturing, huh? The queen smiled and passed on. The queen smiled. She's very pleased with what Alice said. Who are you talking to? Said the king, coming to Alice, and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. The king now notices Alice is talking to the head of a Cheshire cat. It's my friend, she says, the Cheshire cat. Well, allow me to introduce it. It. The animal is an it. I don't like the look of it at all, said the king. However, it may kiss my hand if it likes. Sorry. I'd rather not, the cat remarked. Don't be impertinent, said the king, and don't look at me like that. He got behind Alice as he spoke. The king is afraid, but he's hiding behind Alice. A cat may look at a king, said Alice. I've read that in a book. But I don't remember where. So she remembers reading a cat. Now, if you know, one of the things about reading is you need to have a wide, palette of information. You got to know your stuff. And in the old days, certain kings, a lot of royalty, did not like to be looked at. You put your eyes down, you fall on your face. You just don't look at them. You look to the side. Why? Because they're the king. It's kind of like Moses you don't want to look at in the burning bush. You don't want to look at the bush. Sorry. All right. Anyway, don't look at me like that. A cat may look at the king. So she realizes that there's nothing wrong with that. Well, it must be removed, said the king, very decidedly. He's making a kingly decision. And he called to the queen, who was passing at the moment, my dear, I wish you would have this cat removed. All right, so he's not going to do it. He's calling the queen, who we know is how the queen, we don't even have to read further. We know how the queen's going to remove this cat, don't we? So, in fact, the third person narrator, don't forget who's telling the story, the queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small. Off with his head, said the queen without even looking around. She doesn't care even what the king's talking about. Off with his head. Okay. I'll fetch the executioner myself, said the king eagerly, and he hurried off. Now he's going to get the executioner. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going on. Now, Alice, okay, we're going to get the executioner, chop her friend's head off, and she's going to go back and see how the game's going on. And then as she heard the queen in the distance screaming with passion, remember, the queen screams, shouts, shrieks. She had already heard her sentence, 3 of the players to be executed. You know, the 3 players we're talking about, right? For having missed their turns. It's not the gardeners that she sentenced to death. It's these other 3. And she did not like the look of the things at all, as the game was in such confusion. The croquet game is still, it's confusion, it's chaos. Everything is in chaos. She never knew whether it was her turn or not. So she went off in search of her hedgehog. Okay, I'll just go look for my hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog. A lot of conflict going on, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for croqueting one of them with the other. She's going to whack him, right? The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across the other side of the garden. She lost her flamingo. How many of us have lost our flamingo? Alice could see it trying to, in a helpless sort of way, to fly up into the tree. Of course, flamingos do fly, but it was helpless. You know, sometimes young birds are helpless, like aningas. Sometimes the young aningas has trouble with their wet wings getting into a tree. By the time she caught the flamingo and brought it back, the hedgehog fight, was over, and both hedgehogs were out of sight. She thinks to herself, well, it doesn't matter much, as all the arches, who's the arches? Those are the soldiers that bend over and form arches. They're also gone from this side of the ground. So she tucked the flamingo, away under her arm, and that it, the flamingo, might not escape again, and went back to have a little more conversation with her friend. So it. Don't forget pronouns, the importance of pronouns, not just in this story, but when you're talking to people, you got to make sure you're using pronouns correctly. And I'm not talking about this crazy pronoun stuff swirling around. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she was surprised to find a large crowd collected around it. So suddenly there's a crowd. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, obviously the king found them, the king and the queen. And they were talking all at once. You know what happens when you talk all at once, right? Nobody's listening. I had a great friend who said, you can't learn anything by talking. And that's a true statement. So in this case, Alice isn't talking, she's listening, but everybody's talking at the same time. So, well, the rest of everybody was quiet. Those three were talking at the same time and looked very uncomfortable. So what were they arguing about? The moment Alice appeared, she was appealed to by all there to settle the question. Do you see how the status of Alice is growing? Her importance is growing just by standing up to the queen that time she did that. And she's now, her status is growing. They're calling on her. They're appealing to, oh, please. They're appealing to her to settle the question. And they repeated their arguments to her. It's like she's now the judge and they're in court. Though as they all spoke at once, she found it very hard to make out exactly what they said. You think? Anyway, the third person narrator tells us that the executioner's argument was that you could not cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it off from. And we're going to stop there. That's the first argument. So we now know what they're arguing about. The argument is basically whether or not you can cut off a head without a body. That's the first argument. So it's about chopping heads off. Because don't forget, they're trying to figure out the queen's and whose head are they trying to cut off, figure out if they can cut the head off? Yes, the Cheshire Cat, who, so far as we know, again, just based on the story's narration, so far as we know, is only showing its head. It hasn't materialized its body yet. Before we go on, I just want to briefly show you the rules of croquet. It's on the next page. Here's the official rules. You can Google this yourself. I am not going to read all these rules. It's just, well, first of all, read the first sentence. Croquet can be played in many different forms. Substitute the word life for croquet. Life can be played in many different forms. Serious life is played at an international level. You can have fun with these definitions if you agree, even if you don't agree with the analogy, with the personification, with the example of croquet being like life. And it goes on. The rules of garden croquet. I mean, it goes on and on and on. There's extra shots. There's strategies. There's the law of court setting. Here's the court. Holy cow. There's all sorts of things that you have to be aware of when you play this game. It's much more complex than football and basketball, isn't it? There's a sequence of hoops. If one of your hoops has a blue top, then this should go in position one. I mean, holy moly. Holy moly. Going back to those 2 pages, and I'm going to just stop right now. This is Jimmy. You're reading with Jimmy. My email is jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Thanks for coming by. Look forward to the analysis of the next 2 pages, which I think will be the final 2 pages in this chapter. I am correct. I just peeked. I peeped. See you next time.